first started doing research on Cuba, I went there with the idea that I was going to study the effects of the economic crisis on women, particularly in Cuban society. A lot of the questions that were circulating around that had to do with issues of work. And so I was interested, for example, in whether women were being pushed out of the workforce as job cuts were being put in place by the Cuban government as part of the economic reform package. I was interested in whether women were taking advantage of the new opportunities for entrepreneurship, which had arisen in response to the economic reforms that were put in place in the late 1990s. And I went there basically trying to understand those impacts as a whole on women, not just in the workplace, but in their everyday lives. One of the areas that I was interested in was women who had turned to prostitution as a result of the economic crisis or during the period of the economic crisis. And this was very much kind of a media issue at the time. People were very interested in talking about how prostitution had come back in Cuban society for the first time since the revolution and what that meant in terms of the political and the economic future of Cuban society. And so I knew that this was one of the subject groups that I was going to be studying. So when I first put this project together and I went to the IRB, one of the first things they said, of course, was you've got a vulnerable subject group here. You have some people who basically are engaged in illegal activities. How are you going to protect them? And so thinking through that, basically, in conversation with the IRB reviewers, I wound up writing into the protocol a series of protections for that population group particularly, knowing that I was going to be talking to people who were, engaged in illegal activities and who were vulnerable to harassment or to identification by the state or even stigma from other Cubans. So I knew about that. And as a function of going through that process, I was able to think about what were some of the procedures that I could put in place, like protecting my information really carefully, locking up my computer, putting passwords on it, not using details that weren't necessary to tell a particular story. So when I got to Cuba, one of the things that I fairly quickly realized was that it wasn't just one vulnerable population group that I was dealing with. It wasn't just one class of people who were engaged in illegal economic activities. Most of the people that I knew in Cuba, I realized at some point, were engaged in illicit economic activities, which was a function of the very limited nature of the Cuban government's reforms. And so as I began working with folks and understanding more about how they actually made ends meet on a daily basis, and work was just part of that because their salary was the small part of what they were relying on in order to survive and buy the things that they needed to every day. As I realized how people were actually making their money and actually making ends meet from day to day, I figured out that many, many people were engaged in illegal activities. And as a result of that, I had to kind of back off from the project and go, okay, now I have to treat everybody this way. So it's not just one population group I have to think of. Now I basically have to think about how to protect all of these people, because there was really no telling whether there were going to be repercussions for the kinds of economic crimes that they were involved in. Some of them seemed really small scale, like maybe taking more than you actually needed on your ration card for your gasoline and then reselling that to somebody else. And yet any of those economic crimes could be a big deal in the political and economic climate that I found in Cuba at the time. So I had to basically adapt the methods and adapt the kind of research that I was doing to think through how was I going to protect all of those different kinds of secrets that people were telling me. They were sort of open secrets, but they did not belong in my research in a way that could make people vulnerable or could expose them to harm in some way.